There are really only three things about time that we don't understand: the past, the present, and the future.
Yes, let's deal with the concepts of time. This is going to be cool, weird, and maybe a little bit confusing. Let's try to make it a bit clearer.
The past once existed and now does not exist. The future doesn't exist. And the present, well, you can never really catch up to it. Like right now, you're watching this video. And in the future of this video, I'm going to do something that you've never seen me do in a video before. And that tease that I just did is now in the past. And
when you look at something called the arrow of time, which is basically the directionality of change, because there is really no such thing as time that's flowing, we find out that there are two levels of reality we live in. When you drive a car, ride a bicycle, you're at the Newtonian classical physics level, which has an arrow of time. It has a directionality to it because of what's called the second law of thermodynamics, which are basically how you have a certain number of microstates that form that macrostate of where the bicycle is going. For example, if you crack an egg open, you can't uncrack the egg because you've increased the entropy. That is, the number of microstates that make up the cracked egg is much higher than the number of microstates that would make a put together egg. That's why you can't uncrack it at the Newtonian level.
We live in a world where timing is very, very important. We see a past, present, future, but that's just one part of the brain that kind of sees that. Actually, what we find is that there's a different part of the brain where the future affects the past. There's a different part. That things certain times break down in the timing. There's actually a different from unconscious. There's a thing called the hypnagogic state, a pontine spike, where you're drifting off into sleep. And all of a sudden you're dreaming that you slip and you startle. Now in the real world we seem that we slip, then we jerk, like you slip on a banana, and then you jerk. But in the pontine spike, and this hypnagogic state, it's the other way around. You actually jerk, then you make the dream. So it happens in reverse. It's effect-cause rather than cause-effect. Now, there's another example from reverse speech. Let's look at some of Donald Trump's reverse speech.
Illegal, invalid, so they're pursuing they can't win an election day, and they know their candidates are terrible. Policies are crazy, their politicians are corrupt. The radical Democrats.
Reverse speech seems to be right brain generated from an idea that somehow or another the brain can organize things in reverse, in backwards timing. So this whole idea of reverse causality, retrocausality, has truth inside our neurology.
Reverse speech technology is the most interesting, potentially societal changing thing I've ever heard. And I consider myself a subconscious behaviorist. We're fascinated here with anything that the subconscious controls. And this idea of reverse speech is just phenomenal. So
the name reverse speech refers to hidden messages in our speech. The theory is that as we're speaking, we're creating the sounds of our speech in such a way that we're saying two things at once, one forwards and one backwards. This is a natural function of language. All of us are doing it all the time. What we do is quite literally, we record people speaking and run the tapes in reverse. And when you run the tapes backwards, about once every 30 seconds or so, you can hear a very clear phrase amongst the gibberish. That is what is happening on the conscious as well as the unconscious level. The unconscious mind is speaking in reverse, embedded backwards into the sounds of our speech.
Right.
Now it's absolutely amazing, but children can develop this backward speech at a very early age, and it can be demonstrated and shown. Now, the strange thing is that the brain can actually operate in a backwards manner through time. Rather than subject, predicate, object, it has to work object, predicate, then subject, and it indicates a different function of time.
Because microstates accumulate together to form macrostates. And these macrostates, like a car or bicycle or the egg, have an arrow of time. But here's the amazing thing. The mind may be an emergent property of energy flow. Like electrons and photons are examples of energy. They're smaller than molecules, smaller than even the brain. And so when you look at mental life as a possible emergent property of energy, you realize that its properties are not Newtonian classical physics properties like pushing on something with forces or gravity, but rather they are quantum rules which involve probability distributions and involve the act of consciousness, in some interpretations of quantum physics, on energy probability itself. And what that means is that your state of awareness can actually shift energy. Now I say this because the arrow of time does not exist at the quantum level. These may be thought of as microstates that have no arrow of time, whereas the accumulation of many microstates into a macrostate does have an arrow of time.
You guys, this is crazy. Scientists have created a whole new kind of matter. Yeah, time crystals are here.
On Earth are time crystals. The idea was first proposed in 2012 by Nobel laureate Frank Wilczek of MIT. He suggested a type of matter that exhibits a sort of fundamental oscillation over time. So some property of the material goes through a repeating cycle.
These time crystals have properties we have never before seen in other matter. Usually, matter is motionless at its resting state and only has potential energy until kinetic energy is introduced to it. For example, a ball at rest is chock full of potential energy.
Yes, the world is full of potential energy. And the examples of the Newtonian physics, energy in, energy out, and the flow of energy through time. This is what we see in our macro world. We see things like here a glass of water, which actually water has a liquid crystal state. But yet, as we pour it, there's a uniformity, a consistency. There is a Brownian motion as long as there's temperature. But then once this becomes crystal, then it remains a structure. But a time crystal has a structure in time.
When it's kicked, that energy is converted to kinetic energy, the energy of motion. But time crystals actually move at their resting state or ground state, and that's when atoms have the lowest amount of energy.
But how does that make it a time crystal? The analogy is that regular crystals have a periodic cycle through space. Molecular patterns repeat again and again along their lattices. Time crystals repeat some internal state with constant separations in time. The name time crystal is somewhat out there.
They're like a ball that is forever in motion. In other words, they're always unstable, down to the atomic level. They are the first non-equilibrium matter ever created.
These time crystals have a special quality through time. They have a repeating effect through time.
Regular crystals are an arrangement of atoms in repeated three-dimensional patterns called a lattice. The patterns are duplicated through space, whereas time crystals duplicate their patterns through space and time. They are essentially four-dimensional crystals.
So through these time crystals, there's an open door for us to be able to take our consciousness and work through time as well.
I should also add that while these systems do break continuous time translational symmetry, they have a different type of symmetry, discrete time symmetry. That means if you shift forwards or backwards in time in steps of exactly their period, they will return to the same state.
In theory, the time crystals could move without the application of energy because they would be designed to be inherently unstable, breaking the symmetry of time, resulting in atoms that are in perpetual motion.
Scientists are using the term discrete time crystals to describe such systems. Time crystals could have their first application in quantum computing. Perhaps the most popular approach to building a quantum computing memory element is to use electron spins, which...
Once the theory of time crystals was out there in the ether, researchers focused on coming up with methods to create this new matter that could break time symmetry.
Time crystals could also help bridge the gap between quantum mechanics and general relativity. Before this year, time stood out as a major symmetry that hadn't been broken.
This is like jiggling jello and have it move when you weren't poking it. Researchers had essentially broke the time symmetry and created a new form of non-equilibrium matter that continued moving even at the ground state.
And, unlike in relativity, quantum mechanics treats space and time very differently to each other. Now that we've seen matter settle into discrete lattices in time, just like in regular crystals, perhaps it's a first step in a quantum union of space-time.
Researchers have also remarked that their creation of time crystals is evidence that time symmetry can be broken and that non-equilibrium matter can exist.
So these time crystals, which have broken the fisthold that time, past, present, future, has had, offer us a place that might be able to allow us to affect retrocausality better.
1927 saw the invention of the first quartz crystal clock. This uses the piezoelectric properties of quartz that vibrates at 32,768 hertz, giving it an accuracy of 6 parts per million. But
the piezoelectric effect is very interesting because it can tell us that if we apply pressure to certain crystals, we can generate an electric current. Also, if there's a current that's applied, it can generate the pressure. So thereby, we have the piezoelectric effect. This is part of the principle of the quartz clock. Now, by utilizing this with time crystals, could we not generate a time crystal that would be able to, through time, affect things and allow for the development of retrocausality?
Can the laws of physics also predict the choices that people make? Are there fundamental rules that, when everything is set in motion from a given starting position, lead us inevitably to one and only one possible outcome?
Einstein could not accept ideas of entwinement. He called it spooky action at a distance. He knew it was real, but he couldn't really put it into his framework. We needed a new idea.
His theory of relativity tells us we live in something called a block universe, in which all of space and all of time are laid out like a roll of film, where the past, present, and future all exist at once.
the present is right this very moment. And ironically, by the time you've even processed that moment, it's already in the past.
Means the future can affect the past just as the past affects the future.
The future is not just some series of random events. There are correlations between the present and the future that we can predict. That's what science does.
Deep revelation that helped me understand the nature of awareness, in that the knowing quality of consciousness can feel arrow-free. And yet the knowns, the things we're aware of, like your bicycle moving down the street, has an arrow-bound quality to it. And so for the first time in my life, I was able to explore and explain this deep nature of an arrow-bound time experience and an arrow-free timelessness that we can both experience within consciousness.
You know intuitively that your actions today will influence your circumstances tomorrow. But imagine turning this scenario backwards, that your actions in the future may actually be influencing your circumstances today.
The delayed choice experiment has told us that there is an ability that if the observer makes his observation in the future, that it can affect things in the past. This has now been a hallmark for us to understand our physics and to understand quantum theory, that the future can affect the past.
In the course of making these predictions, it's more natural to think of the universe as being one continuous structure rather than being a bunch of frames cut up and spread all over the floor.
Quantum entanglement. As we'll see in the future, entangled particles really are able to influence each other instantaneously. And we'll see that their non-locality doesn't violate causality.
Ken believes that all events, even quantum events, have a definite starting point and a definite ending point. But there is uncertainty in what happens in between.
So perhaps they can even affect coherence and decoherence retroactively and physically without making a causal mess. Perhaps this thing we call observation is just entanglement between the observer and the experiment.
Way to make sense of this is retrocausality. The idea that it is our future choice that causes that uncertainty.
Retrocausality means the future affects the past.
Perhaps the evolving tapestry of entanglement, in all its impossible complexity, is what really defines reality in this space-time.
The beginning and ending of events are fixed in time, but Ken argues quantum physics creates flexibility in the middle. And that flexibility offers us the chance to control our fate.
What is absolutely clear in these experiments is that the measurement of a particle in the present can influence the properties of that particle in the past.
In the Newtonian clockwork universe, the initial state and the laws determine everything there is. There's no freedom given the initial state. In a time-symmetric universe, it's not obvious that that's true, because if something is dependent not only on the initial state.
In other words, a decision made in the present can influence something in the past. The effect seems to precede the cause.
But equally on the final state. Now, those intermediate events aren't predetermined in the sense they're not determined by the initial state. They might eventually be determined, but there's more wiggle room for free will.
Could it be possible that the future can influence the present? An enhanced version of the famous double-slit experiment, called the delayed choice quantum eraser, implies exactly that mind-blowing scenario that future events can influence past results.
In other words, the endpoints of our fates may be fixed, but we don't know how precisely we will reach them.
I don't know what I'm going to decide in 1 minute. And yet, that decision will be made. It will be determined.
But maybe our sense of time flowing in one direction is not something that entangled systems are constrained by. The entangled particles seem to be immune to the direction of time, or are somehow connected in time even when they're not connected in space. Maybe our causal experience is just that, an experience, but not the true nature of reality.
So there's a perfect example of something that I don't know and is not possibly not determined just by the past, but nevertheless will eventually be determined.
Scientists reverse time using quantum computer. Yes, you heard that right. A group of researchers managed to reverse the flow of time during an experiment they conducted on a quantum computer. Let us explain. A team of researchers from the Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology used a quantum system program to reverse the state of a quantum computer a fraction of a second into the past. According to the paper published in the journal Scientific Reports, they performed the experiments on 2 quantum bits, also known as qubits. Qubits are represented by a 1, a 0, or both at the same time. During the first stage of the experiment, the 2 qubits were unaltered. In the second stage, called degradation, scientists used a computer program to alter the order of the previous stage, causing the qubits to become a random assortment of 1s and 0s. The process is then followed by the time reversal stage. At this time, the program reverses the chaotic effect of the qubits. Finally, during the regeneration stage, the qubit reverts to the same original state before it had been disrupted by the computer program. The program was able to successfully restore 85% of the cases where 2 qubits were involved. Through this program, the researchers were able to create a state that evolved against the second law of thermodynamics, which states that the state of entropy or disruption of the universe increases over time, meaning that changes of a state in a closed system can remain static but cannot be reversed. The researchers used the example of cue balls on a pool table. Imagine them formed in a pyramid shape at the center and then being hit, causing them to disperse. Now imagine the process in reverse. The balls retrace the path they took when they were hit and return to the original triangular formation. This is similar to what the researchers accomplished with quantum bits. Although this doesn't mean we will be traveling through time on a DeLorean anytime soon, it will help us achieve a deeper understanding of quantum physics and time.
only time that really matters is right now. No matter what you're doing, whenever and wherever you are living in a perpetual now. The moment you are living right now is the only time that moment is ever going to happen in all of history. So make the most of it.
Light is coming from a quasar, a couple of thousand light years away. And it's having a gravity effect around a galaxy so that the photons are hitting us at the same time. And that yet, the observation of these photons can affect the past. Now, it's very difficult to believe that it can affect such a long-range reaching idea of the past. Hard for us to deal with, but yet science is hinting that we can affect the past with our observations.
The depression comes from living in the past, and anxiety comes from living in the future. But happiness, that comes from living right now.
So the delayed choice experiment, the ideas of entanglement, entwinement, the whole idea of now time and different energy is taking a new effect as we start to see that our conscious system, through observations, is having the ability to affect the past. And if we could build a time clock that would allow us to intensify this action, could we then be able to affect our past and improve our lives? So we take our time crystals. These are crystals that are made as a different type of matter, independent of most time. Now, if we take then and put the time crystals in between two magnets, a constant set of pressure, this will produce a piezoelectric type of effect, a type of voltage. The time crystals thereby, next to the piezoelectric crystals, will create a fluctuation which will make a type of current that has a timeless capacity to it. Now, if we take this process, run it through a caduceus coil, like we see here, the type of caduceus coil, and this type of caduceus coil, which will have a space-time effect and create a non-Hertzian waveform. Non-Hertzian meaning independent from time. So now we've made ourselves a time event. Utilizing the human mind, the human consciousness, the quantic system, and the proper vibrations, we'll be able to meditate, concentrate, and affect a portal through time to be able to send communication back into the past, into the future. Because time does not really exist as we think it does. Time is really more of a quasi-area, less of a river and more of an ocean. So now as we start to see, we can have these effects. So what have we learned through this process? Time as we perceive it does not really exist. Our minds are quantic in nature. Quantic systems have a timeless quality. Observations determine reality. Firm observations are resistant to change. A firm observation is difficult to change because it has been made. But see, subtle information, subtle observations of the past can be changed by concentration, quantic concentration from the future. Recreating, restructuring the past is possible with focused intent. The time crystals will allow us to have more of an effect over the time and to amplify our own abilities. We can make a scalar, non-Hertzian timeless field. We can set up the tachyon time vibrations, and our quantic mind can be trained to communicate and thus affect the past or the future. So through focused intention, we can learn to affect the past. Here's a little taste.
You have to go climb mountains or make every moment big. It just means from time to time throughout your day, just kind of stop for a second. Just soak it in.